Clara stood at the freshly turned earth of her grandfather's grave. The November air was damp and cold, clinging to her black coat, making the fabric feel heavy. Arthur, the man who had been her entire world, the man who had raised her, was gone. She clutched the heavy, old-fashioned bakery keys he had left her, the metal biting into her palm. It was the only solid thing she felt. As the last of the other mourners, old neighbors and loyal customers, drifted away toward their cars, a man in a cheap-looking, wrinkled suit stepped onto the damp grass. He wasn't from the neighborhood. He held out a thick white envelope. "Clara Mills," he asked, his voice neutral, as if he were asking for the time. She could only nod, her throat thick with unshed tears, her whole body numb. The papers he served her were a legal notice, a summons. She didn't understand the dense legal words at first, but two names leaped out from the page. Names she had not seen in print for 25 years. Mark and Sarah Mills. Her biological parents. The two people who had driven away in separate cars, leaving her on a cold porch with a stuffed rabbit. They had returned. The legal jargon, as she read it again, boiled down to one horrifying fact: they were formally contesting Arthur's will. Their stated goal was to seize the bakery, the ovens, the apartment above it, the only home Clara had ever truly known. They were claiming they were her only legal guardians, that Arthur's will, leaving everything to her, was invalid. Her helplessness was a sudden, cold wave that made her knees weak. Her lawyer, Mr. Bowen, a kind, elderly man who had been Arthur's friend, had warned her this might happen. He'd been searching Arthur's files for a final adoption decree and had found nothing. On paper, her parents' rights might never have been legally severed. Their claim, built on blood they had abandoned, was powerful. It was terrifying. But as her fingers tightened around the worn brass keys, a memory, sharp and clear, cut through the panic. Her grandfather's voice, a lesson from a long-ago afternoon spent at the kneading trough, his big hands guiding hers in the flour. "Love is smart, Clara," he had said, his voice a low rumble. "It sees what's coming. It always prepares." The bell above the bakery door chimed softly when she pushed it open hours later. It was a sound that had marked the entire rhythm of her life. Arthur opening at 4 a.m., the clatter of the first delivery trucks, the chatter of the first customers, the after-school rush, him locking up at 6 p.m. Tonight, the chime just echoed in the dark. Empty space. The air inside was still and cool, but the familiar smells were baked into the very walls. A layered history of comfort. She breathed in deeply, closing her eyes. Yeast. From the sourdough starter Arthur had named Barnaby and kept alive for 30 years in a crock by the oven. A faint, lingering hint of cinnamon and cardamom from the last batch of sticky buns. And underneath it all, the sweet, woody scent of her grandfather's pipe tobacco. It lingered in the curtains of the small back office, and she prayed it never, ever would leave. She ran her hand along the main counter. A massive piece of butcher block, its surface worn smooth and beautifully concave in the middle from decades of work. Arthur had built it himself, just as he had built the tall, sturdy shelves and the rolling cooling racks. She could still see his hands, large and webbed with small, white scars from old kitchen burns, his knuckles swollen with arthritis, but always so gentle. He would be standing right here, dusting the counter with flour, and she, a small 8-year-old girl perched on a high stool, would be right next to him. She could feel the memory in her own hands, the sticky, wet dough clinging to her fingers, her childish frustration as it wouldn't do what she wanted. "Not so hard, little bird," he would say, his voice a patient rumble. He would place his big, warm hands over hers, guiding her. "You have to feel the dough. Listen to it. It's alive. You just have to treat it with respect." This place wasn't just a building. It was her education. It was her safety. It was 25 years of proof that she was wanted. She walked behind the counter and leaned her forehead against the cold stainless steel of the big, double-deck oven. She remembered how he'd polished this very steel the night before he went to the hospital. A clean kitchen is a happy kitchen. Clara, he'd said, though his breathing was shallow. He had known. He must have known he wasn't coming back. Had he been afraid? Afraid for her. The thought that he had spent his last days worried about her. About this. Sent a fresh stab of grief through her. He had spent his whole life protecting her. And in the end, she couldn't protect him from time. Sitting on the small wooden stool by the cooling racks, the one he'd built for her tiny legs, Clara let the memory she kept chained in the basement of her mind come upstairs. It was always there. Waiting. She was 8 years old again. She was standing in the hallway of a house that felt wrong. The heat was off, and she could see her breath. For weeks, her parents, Mark and Sarah, had been whispering. Now, they were yelling. The whispers had been scarier, but the yelling was final. Her father's latest business idea, some get-rich-quick scheme involving imported tools, had collapsed, taking all their money with it. The bank was taking the house. She saw 2 large, ugly brown suitcases by the front door. Her father, Mark, slammed one shut and zipped it with a sound that felt like a rip. He grabbed her older brother, Leo, by the arm. Leo was 10. He looked terrified. "You're with me," Mark said. His voice was flat. Dead. He didn't look at Clara. Her mother, Sarah, was shoving clothes into a smaller bag. A soft-sided duffel. She grabbed Clara's younger sister, Mia, by the hand. Mia was only 6. She was crying, her face red and puffy. "We're going to Grandma's," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the doorknob. "We're going to start over." Clara stood frozen in her sock feet on the cold linoleum floor. She was clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was a baby. Its name was Patches, and one of its button eyes was missing. "What about me?" The words were so small, she wasn't sure she'd said them out loud. But her mother heard. Sarah paused, her hand on the latch. She finally, turned and looked at Clara. Her eyes were empty. There was no anger. No sadness. There was just nothing. As if she were looking at a piece of furniture she couldn't take with her. "Stay here," Sarah said. "Someone will come for you." Then she and Mia were gone. The door clicked shut. A minute later, Clara heard 2 car engines start. One went left. One went right. They drove off in different directions. She stayed in the hallway for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on her. She felt like she had done something wrong, but she didn't know what. She was the one who wasn't chosen. Leo was strong. Mia was little. What was she? She was just Clara, the one in the middle, the quiet one, the one who was easy to forget. She finally crept to the window and saw the porch. "Stay here," her mother had said. So she went to the porch. She sat. She waited. She was a good girl. She would do as she was told. Someone would come. She sat on the top step of the concrete front porch, pulling her knees to her chest to stay warm. She watched the sky turn from a pale, sick-looking gray to a deep, dark blue, and then to black. The streetlights came on, casting yellow pools on the empty sidewalk. A neighbor's dog barked, and then stopped. She wasn't sure how long she sat there. 1 hour, 3. It felt like a whole lifetime. She was starting to shiver, the cold seeping through her thin sweater. A truck she didn't recognize at first pulled up to the curb. It was old and dark green. A tall, broad man got out. It was her grandfather, Arthur, her father's dad. He owned the bakery downtown. He always smelled like bread and something sweet, like cinnamon. He didn't visit much. Her father always said he was old-fashioned and stuck in his ways. He walked up the path and stopped when he saw her. A small, dark bundle huddled by the door. His face, usually so calm and lined with flour, seemed to break. She saw his shoulders drop, and he let out a long, ragged breath that turned white in the cold air. He didn't say, "Where's your father?" He didn't ask, "Where's your mother?" He didn't ask what happened. He just walked up the steps, shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the one that smelled like his pipe and baking spices, and wrapped it around her. It swallowed her up in warmth, and a feeling of safety so profound it made her want to cry. He picked her up as if she weighed nothing. "Let's go home. Clara," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He carried her to his truck, buckled her into the high passenger seat, and drove her through the dark town to the small, warm apartment above the bakery. He made her a cup of hot milk with honey, stirring it slowly with a spoon, and sat in the worn armchair by her cot until her shivering stopped, and she finally fell asleep. In all the 25 years that followed, he never once spoke a bad word about Mark or Sarah. He just loved her. He just stayed. A week after the funeral, after the legal papers had turned her grief to a cold, sickening fear, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, her hands deep in a batch of brioche dough. But her lawyer had told her to answer everything. "Hello," she said, balancing the phone on her shoulder. Her voice strained. "Clara," a man's voice. "Hesitant. Unfamiliar. This is..." "Well, it's Leo, your brother." Clara stopped kneading. The dough, warm and elastic, stuck to her hands. Leo. She hadn't heard his name, hadn't said his name, in over 2 decades. We all heard about Arthur." He fumbled, his voice cracking. "We're so sorry. We're in town. Dad, he's handling the arrangements. We all want to talk to you, to see you." The "we all" landed like a stone in her stomach. It felt coordinated. It felt wrong. She agreed to meet them at a neutral place. A small, generic coffee shop 3 blocks from the bakery. She got there early, choosing a table in the back corner where she could see the door. She needed to see them before they saw her. She watched them walk in, a bizarre parody of a family. Her father, Mark, looked older. Of course, his hair thin and gray, but he had the same restless, shifty energy, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for a threat or an opportunity. Her mother, Sarah, looked worn down. She had dyed her hair a brassy, artificial blonde and clutched her purse to her chest with both hands. Leo was tall, a softer, weaker version of their father. And Mia, or her little sister, was a fashionable stranger who kept glancing at her phone, looking profoundly uncomfortable. They sat down. The awkwardness was a physical thing, a heavy blanket smothering the table. They asked her polite, meaningless questions. "Do you like living in the city?" "The bakery. It's a nice little business." "Right." They talked about themselves. They talked about how hard things had been for them. How Leo had to move 3 times in high school. How Mia had a tough time adjusting. How her mother had to work 2 jobs. Clara wanted to laugh. Mia had a tough time adjusting. Clara had to learn to sleep in a new bed, in a new room, in a new life, wondering every single night if her grandfather would get tired of her, too, and tell her to stay here one morning. She had spent the first full year at his bakery flinching every time he raised his voice, even in laughter, terrified that any mistake, a spilled bag of flour, a burned batch of cookies, would be the one that made him send her away. Her adjustment was a raw, silent terror she had lived with for years. A terror these people, her family, knew nothing about. They talked about their struggles as if they were unique, as if they were the only victims of the choices they had made. Clara just listened. She stirred her coffee, which had long gone cold. She felt strangely detached, as if she were watching a bad play. She felt no anger, no sadness, just a cold, vast emptiness. They were trying to build a bridge of shared hardship, but they had left her on the other side of the river. Finally, Mark, her father, leaned forward. Placing his hands flat on the table, he cleared his throat, adopting a tone of false fatherly seriousness. "Look, Clara," he said, trying to sound reasonable. "We know this is strange, and we regret how things happened. We really do." Sarah nodded quickly, her eyes filling with tears that looked watery and thin. "We were young, and we made mistakes," Sarah whispered, dabbing at her eye with a napkin. "But," Mark continued, cutting his wife off, his voice becoming firmer, "the point is, we're your family, your real family, blood, and that bakery, that whole building, it was my father's. It belongs to me. It's only right that we get our share. It's our inheritance." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. A cold, hard clarity settled over her. She looked at Leo and Mia. Leo was suddenly fascinated by the sugar packets. Mia was biting her thumbnail, refusing to meet her eyes. They knew. This is why they were here. It was never about her. It was never about reconnecting or regret. It was about the money. It had always been about the money. The love, the bakery, the home Arthur had built for her to them. It was just a piece of property, an asset to be claimed. They had looked up the property value. They had seen the bakery, Arthur's Breads, featured in that local magazine last year, the one that called it a beloved neighborhood institution. They didn't see a home. They saw a payday. They looked at her, and they didn't see a daughter or a sister they had wronged. They saw an obstacle. Clara left the coffee shop feeling like she couldn't breathe properly. The cold air outside felt good, but it couldn't clear the sick. Cold feeling in her stomach. That word share, it echoed in her head. They thought this was about a share. They saw her grandfather's life's work as a pie to be cut into pieces. She walked the 3 blocks back to the bakery, not seeing the pavement, her gaze fixed on nothing. She locked the door behind her, flipped the open sign to closed, even though it was only 3 p.m., and slumped onto the stool by the kneading table. She put her head in her hands, the smell of flour and yeast on her palms, suddenly smelling like her own fear. The next morning, she was at Mr. Bowen's office at 9 a.m., sharp. His office was like him old, a bit cluttered, but solid and comforting. It smelled like old books and the mints he always kept in a crystal dish on his desk. He looked tired. He had been Arthur's friend for 40 years, and his grief was as real as Clara's. "I spent all weekend in the county archives, Clara," he said, folding his hands on his desk. He didn't meet her eye, which was the first bad sign. "I went through every file, every registry from 25 years ago. I found the initial guardianship papers. When Arthur took you in, that was all in order. But I can't find a final adoption decree. I can't find anything." Clara's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" "Mr. Bowen." He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a pained kindness. "It means that on paper, legally, Mark and Sarah are still your parents. Their rights were never terminated. But they left me," Clara whispered. It sounded so simple, so childish, but it was the only truth that mattered. "They abandoned me. Isn't that enough? Morally?" "Yes, Mr. Bowen Sahil," rubbing his temples. "In the eyes of God and any decent person, yes, but in the eyes of the law, it's complicated. They will argue they were young, in crisis, and that they left you with your grandfather, which isn't the same as leaving you on a stranger's doorstep. Their lawyer is sharp. He's building a case that Arthur was only ever your custodian or guardian, not your legal father. But the will..." Clara's voice was thin. "Arthur left everything to me. He signed it. You were the witness." "I know," he said, leaning forward. "And the will is strong. But their argument is that they are the rightful heirs. Mark is Arthur's only son. They are claiming Arthur was not of sound mind, or that you, as his caretaker, exerted undue influence over him. It's a nasty, ugly tactic. Clara, and it's designed to drag this out. They're arguing that his true heir is his son, Mark, and that leaving the family legacy to a precipice, a ward, was a betrayal of his bloodline. The word ward stung like a slap. After 25 years of being his daughter, of calling him dad in everything but name, of being the one to hold his hand as he passed, she was being reduced to a legal term. A ward. An outsider. "What do we do?" she asked. Her hands clenched in her lap. "We fight," he said, his voice firming. "We find that adoption decree." Arthur was a smart man, but he was private. He kept his own files. He must have kept a copy. "You need to go through everything in that apartment." Everything. Clara left the office with a thin, fragile thread of hope. He was right. Arthur was smart. He wouldn't have left her exposed like this. He must have kept the papers. But her family didn't wait for her to find them. The pressure started that very afternoon. The bakery was busy. The after-school rush had just started by 11. The small space filled with the smell of fresh chocolate chip cookies and the sounds of mothers chatting and children laughing. Clara was bagging a dozen rolls for Mrs. Peterson, one of her oldest customers. When the bell above the door chimed, her parents, Mark and Sarah, walked in. They stood near the door for a moment, looking around as if they were customers, and it made Clara's skin crawl. Then, Sarah spotted Mrs. Peterson. "Oh, Martha, isn't it?" Sarah said, walking over, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Sarah, Clara's mother. We're just so proud of what she's done with her father's place." Mrs. Peterson, a kind woman in her 70s, looked utterly confused. She glanced from Sarah to Clara and back again. Her mother. "Oh, my. I always thought Arthur." "Oh, Arthur was a saint," Sarah gushed, cutting her off, taking her in like that when we were having such a hard time. "We've been away, but now we're back. To be a family again." Clara watched, frozen behind the counter. She felt the heat rising in her face. The chatter in the bakery died down. Everyone was listening. Her parents were poison, seeping into her sanctuary, turning the warm, happy atmosphere cold and sour. They weren't just after the building. They were trying to rewrite her life, to steal her story with Arthur and replace it with their lies. The next day, it got worse. Sarah came in alone. During the morning lull, Clara was in the back, pulling a rack of sourdough loaves from the oven. The heat, a familiar, comforting blast on her face. When she came out, wiping her hands on her apron, Sarah was standing behind the counter, holding the pastry tongs, rearranging the danishes on the tray. A cold, sharp anger cut through Clara. "What are you doing?" Sarah jumped, startled. She put the tongs down with a clatter. I was just helping. Dear. This one," she pointed with a perfectly manicured nail, "was falling off the plate. You know, presentation is everything." "Please," Clara said, her voice low and shaking. "Don't touch anything. You are not an employee here. You are a customer. Please, go to the other side of the counter." Sarah's face crumpled. It was a practiced, perfect expression of hurt. Her lower lip trembled. "Clara, I'm just trying to help. I'm just trying to be your mother. Is that so terrible I'm trying to make up for lost time? You're so cold. After everything, I'm the one trying to build a bridge." Clara gripped the edge of the counter. Her knuckles were white. She could feel the stares of the two customers sitting by the window. She bit her bottom lip, just as she had done as a child to keep from crying. She wanted to scream. She wanted to yell, "Where were you when I had the flu so bad? Arthur had to sit with me for 3 nights. Where were you when I graduated high school? Where were you when I fell off my bike and he carried me home?" But the words wouldn't come. All she could say, in a voice that was barely a whisper, was, You had 25 years to be my mother. You're too late. Please. Leave. Sarah looked wounded. A perfect martyr. She walked out of the bakery, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. Clara knew this wasn't a defeat. It was a performance. A performance for the customers, for the neighborhood. She was painting Clara as the cold love. Ungrateful daughter. The final blow came that night. She was locking up, her body aching with exhaustion and stress, when she saw a figure leaning against the lamppost across the street. It was Leo, her brother. He crossed the street as she turned the key in the lock. Clara. Wait, he called out. She turned, her hand tight on her keys. What do you want? Leo. It looked uncomfortable, shoving his hands into the pockets of his thin jacket. I just wanted to talk. Mom's really upset. You know, you were pretty hard on her. She was behind my counter. Leo. Touching things. She was trying to connect, he said, his voice rising with a note of frustration. Why do you have to be so difficult? Look, Clara. They're old. They're broke. They made a mistake. A huge mistake. Okay, I get it. You're angry. But can't you just share? Why do you have to be so greedy? The word hit her like a physical blow. Greedy. She, who had worked in this bakery since she could see over the counter. She, who had slept on a cot in the stockroom during Arthur's last few weeks so she could be there to help him to the bathroom. She, who was trying to protect the only home she had ever known. She was the greedy one. Greedy, she repeated. The word felt disgusting in her mouth. They abandoned me. Leo. They left me on a porch. And they didn't come back for the bakery. They came back for the money. This building, that's all they see. And you. You're with them. Leo had the grace to look ashamed, but it quickly hardened into the same defensive anger she'd seen in her father. It's Dad's inheritance. Clara, he's the son. What did you expect that he'd just let you have it all? Blood is blood. You should be grateful you got to live here at all. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the dark. Clara stood on the sidewalk, the streetlights blurring as her eyes finally laden, finally filled with hot, angry tears. She felt it then. The thing she hadn't felt in decades. The old, familiar, crushing feeling of being worthless. The voice of the 8-year-old girl, the one she thought she had outgrown, was screaming inside her. Maybe they're right. Maybe you are greedy. Maybe you don't deserve it. You're not his daughter. You're not his blood. You're just the one they left behind. She started to doubt. Not just herself, but Arthur. Why hadn't he filed the papers? Did he forget? Was it not that important to him? Did he, in some small part of his heart, just see her as a ward? The doubt was a new kind of grief, an acid that burned away the foundations of her entire life. She felt utterly alone, just as she had on that porch. Only this time, there was no truck pulling up to the curb. No one was coming to save her. She stumbled up the stairs to the apartment, her legs shaking. She had to find those papers. She couldn't let them win. She couldn't let them rewrite her story. She couldn't let them make Arthur's love for her mean nothing. She went straight to his old roll-top desk, the one in the corner of the living room. Her hands were shaking as she started to pull out drawers. She wasn't neat. She was desperate. She pulled out stacks of old bills, bundled neatly with rubber bands, old tax returns, folders full of recipes he'd clipped from magazines. With his spidery handwriting in the margins, try with more ginger or too sweet for Clara. She found packets of photographs her at her high school graduation, arm in arm with Arthur, her at her 10th birthday, covered in flour, beaming over a lopsided cake, her as a tiny, solemn child, asleep on his big armchair. He had kept everything. She searched for hours. She went through his closet, his dresser, the trunk at the foot of his bed. She found his old service medals, his father's watch, a lock of her own childhood hair tied with a blue ribbon, But there were no legal papers, no adoption decree, no termination of rights. Nothing. By 2 a.m., she was sitting on the floor, surrounded by the boxed-up contents of her grandfather's life. The apartment was a mess, and her hope was gone. They were going to win. She started to put things back in a numb daze. She picked up his old wooden valet tray from the dresser, where he used to empty his pockets every night. Coins, a pocket knife, receipts, and something else, tucked in the back of a small, felt-lined compartment. She saw a glint of metal. It was a small key, a very old, odd-looking brass key, attached to a simple, worn leather string. She didn't recognize it. It didn't go to the bakery, or the apartment, or the cash box. It was small, almost like a key for a diary or a music box. It was tiny. She held it in her palm. It was heavy for its size. She had no idea what it was for, but Arthur had kept it here. With his most personal, everyday things, she closed her hand around it, the metal pressing into her skin. It was the only thing she'd found that she couldn't explain. With a sigh, she slipped the leather string into the pocket of her jeans and continued the hopeless task of cleaning up. The phone call from Mr. Bowen came 2 days later, and it was the one she had been dreading. "Clara, they've filed an emergency motion with the court," he said. His voice was grim. "They've asked the judge to freeze your assets, including the bakery's business accounts. They are claiming, and this is a lie, but it's a fast one, that you're liquidating assets, that you're selling off bakery equipment to hide the money." Clara sank onto the apartment steps, the phone cold against her ear. "What I just bought flour. I bought 500 pounds of flour. Like I do every month." "I know," Mr. Bowen said, his voice heavy with frustration. "But they're twisting it. They're saying it's an unusually large purchase, that you're stockpiling supplies to run an off-the-books cash business. It's ridiculous. But the judge, he's granted a temporary hearing. He hasn't frozen the accounts yet, but he set a hearing date for next week. If we don't present something definitive, Clara, he's going to grant it." The world tilted. "Freeze my accounts, but I can't pay my suppliers. I can't pay Louis. I can't buy butter. I can't run the bakery." "That's what they want," he said, his voice hard. "They want to choke you out. They want to make it impossible for you to fight them. So you'll be forced to settle." She hung up the phone, her hand trembling so badly she dropped it on the floor. She could lose it. She could lose all of it. Not in months. In days. The bakery. Her home. Her grandfather's life's work. All of it could be shut down. The doors locked by a court order. All because of a lie about flour. She pictured the big, beautiful ovens going cold. She pictured Luis, who had a family to support, looking at her with confusion as she told him she couldn't write his paycheck. She pictured the closed sign hanging in the window, not for an afternoon, but forever. She didn't even realize she was crying. Silent, hot tears running down her face and dripping onto her apron, until the bell chimed downstairs. She ignored it. It chimed again, followed by a persistent knocking. "Clara, we know you're in there." It was Maya, her best friend, the one who had been with her through every small crisis of her adult life. Maya had her own key. A moment later, she was coming up the stairs, followed by Luis, the head baker, his tall frame filling the doorway, his face creased with worry. "Your lights are on." But the door was locked, Maya said, her voice full of concern. She saw Clara's face, the phone on the floor, the tear tracks. "Oh, honey. What did they do now?" Luis, a quiet gentleman who had started as Arthur's apprentice 15 years ago, just looked at her, his dark eyes full of a deep, steady understanding. He looked around the apartment, at the boxes she hadn't finished repacking. At the general air of despair, Clara told them, her voice cracking, about the hearing, the frozen accounts, the lie about the flower. They're going to take it. Maya, they're going to win. I can't find the papers. I've looked everywhere. He must have forgotten. He must not have filed them. Maya was instantly furious, pacing the small living room. That's not. They can't. We'll hold a bake sale. We'll tell the customers. We'll start a fund. It's not about money. Maya, Clara said, her voice flat. It's about the law. I can't prove I'm his daughter. Luis, who had been silent, finally spoke. He shook his head, not in sadness, but in disagreement. He ran his hand over the worn arm of Arthur's chair. No, he said, his voice a low, certain rumble. You're wrong, Clara. Clara and Maya both looked at him. What do you mean? Luis. Arthur, he said. He was the most careful man I ever met. He was meticulous. You know how he was with his bread. The temperature, the timing, the weight of the salt. Every single thing. Perfect. Every time. He looked at Clara. He taught me that, he used to say, a good baker leaves nothing to chance. Luis. Not one thing. You think a man like that? A man who loved you would leave this to chance, this, the most important thing in his life. He shook his head again, more firmly. He was too smart for that. He wouldn't let this happen. He wouldn't leave you unprotected. Luis's words hung in the air. He was too smart. He wouldn't leave you unprotected. And then, it happened. Not a flash of light, but a small, warm spark. A memory, dislodged by Luis's words. It was like a piece of dough that had been overproofed, suddenly rising to the surface. She wasn't in the apartment. She was 10 years old, and she was in the basement. It was a Saturday, and she was supposed to be sweeping, but she was perched on her grandfather's old workbench, watching him work. The basement was his workshop. It was crammed with tools, old wooden cabinets, and the smell of sawdust and varnish. He was sanding a small intricately carved wooden box. What's that? Grandpa, she had asked, swinging her legs. This, he said, not looking up from his work, is a box for secrets. He had shown her how the lid fit so perfectly, you almost couldn't see the seam. You have secrets, she'd giggled. He'd smiled. Arare. Full smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Every good craftsman has a secret. Clara. A place to keep what's most precious. He'd tapped the side of the massive workbench she was sitting on. It was a beast, made of thick, dark wood, stained and scarred from 100 projects. Like this bench, my father built this, and he built a secret into it. Taught me how. He'd made her jump down, and he ran his hand along the smooth, worn side, a place she'd leaned against 1,000 times. His fingers had stopped on a small, carved leaf, part of a decorative border. He'd pushed it, just pushed it, inward, and she'd heard a tiny click. Her heart was pounding in her chest. Not in the apartment. In the present. The basement, she whispered. Maya and Luis looked at her. What? The workbench, Clara said, her voice trembling with a new, terrifying hope. His workbench. In the basement. He told me it had a secret. She was on her feet, running for the basement door, pulling the string for the single. Bare light bulb. The light clicked on, illuminating the cold concrete steps. She half flew down them, Maya and Luis right behind her. The basement was just as she remembered. Dusty, crammed, smelling of earth and old wood. And there, against the far wall, was the workbench. It was covered in a dusty tarp. She ripped it off, the canvas pulling a cloud of dust into the air, making her cough. It was just as she remembered. Solid. Ancient. Scarred. He said. He said there was a leaf. She whispered, her hands flying over the decorative carved border on the side. It was dark, and the carvings were shallow. She couldn't see. She ran her fingertips over the wood, feeling the grooves. Vine. Leaf. Leaf. And flower. Leaf. Her finger pressed against one of the leaves, and it moved. It wasn't a push. It was a slide. It slid sideways, into the wood, revealing. Not a button, not a handle. A keyhole. A tiny, small, brass-lined keyhole. Oh my God. Maya breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. Clara's own hand flew to the pocket of her jeans. Her fingers fumble, then closed around the small, heavy object on the leather string. She pulled it out. The small, odd-looking brass key. The one she'd found in his valet tray. Her hands were shaking so hard she couldn't fit it into the hole. Luis, she said, her voice a squeak. You. I can't. Luis, his own hands, large but rock-steady, took the key from her. He blew the dust from the keyhole, slid the key in. And it fit. It fit perfectly. He turned it. There was a loud, satisfying click that echoed in the small, silent basement. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a thin line appeared in the wood, just below the border. A narrow, hidden drawer, fitting so perfectly it had been invisible. Slid open half an inch. Clara stared at it. She reached out a trembling hand and pulled it. The drawer slid open smoothly, on well-oiled glides. It was dark inside. She reached in and her fingers touched cold metal. She pulled out a long, narrow metal box, the kind people used to use for bonds or important papers. It was heavy. She carried it upstairs, back into the light of the apartment. She set it on the kitchen table. Maya and Luis stood on either side of her, barely breathing. The box wasn't locked. She lifted the small latch. She opened the lid. Inside, resting on dark blue velvet, were 3 items. The first was a thick, folded document, oficial, stamped with a gold seal. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the dense type. Final decree of adoption. It was dated 24 years ago. Signed by a judge, stamped by the county clerk. He hadn't just filed it. It was done. She was, legally, his daughter. The second document was older, on thinner, yellowing paper. It was folded in 3. Voluntary termination of parental rights. She saw the signatures at the bottom. Mark Mills. Sarah Mills. They had signed her away. The third was a single sheet of notebook paper, folded into a small square. It was a letter. The handwriting was her father's. Messy. Angry. Looping. She unfolded it and read it aloud. Her voice hollow. Arthur. Here are the signed papers like you wanted. Now send the $5. 000. Like we agreed. Take the kid. She's your problem now. We're starting over. Don't try to find us. Mark. Clara sank into a chair, her legs giving out. She held the letter in her hand. $5,000. They hadn't just left her. They hadn't just abandoned her. They had sold her. They had sold her to the only man in the world who loved her. For $5,000. So they could start over. Luis let out a long, slow breath. A sound of pure disgust. Maya just sank into the chair opposite Clara, her face white. Clara looked at the papers. The adoption decree. The termination of rights. The letter. Her grandfather hadn't just saved her. He hadn't just raised her. He had bought her. He had paid them. The people who were supposed to love her most. To go away. And he had kept the proof. He had kept it. Hidden and safe. For 25 years. He hadn't been forgetful. He hadn't been careless. He had been smart. Just as Luis said. He had been a good craftsman, leaving nothing to chance. He had protected her. One last time, even from the grave. He knew that someday, when he was gone, the same greed that had made them sell their daughter would make them come back for his home. He had known, and he had prepared. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday, in Mr. Bowen's largest conference room. It was meant to be a final settlement conference before the hearing to freeze her accounts. Clara walked in, not with her lawyer, but with Maya and Luis. They were not there to be her witnesses. They were there as her family. She was calm. She had slept for the first time in weeks. A deep, solid sleep in her grandfather's bed. The metal box with the papers was in her bag. They were already there. Mark, Sarah, Leo, and Mia, and a sharp-looking lawyer in an expensive suit Clara had never seen before. They looked confident, smug, even. Mark nodded at her. A small, tight gesture, as if he were the one in charge, the one who was graciously giving her a moment of his time. Sarah was examining her nails. "Thank you for coming, Clara," their lawyer said, opening a sleek leather folder. His voice was smooth. "My clients, your parents, are prepared to be extremely generous to resolve this unfortunate family matter. They are, of course, the primary heirs to Mr. Primary, Mills's estate, but in the interest of, well, in the interest of peace. They have an offer." Clara just looked at him. She said nothing. Mr. Bowen sat at the head of the table, his hands folded. The lawyer continued, his voice oozing false sympathy. "They have agreed to allow you, Miss Clara, to remain as a tenant in the apartment above the bakery, at a very reasonable, below-market rent, for as long as you wish. The business itself, of course, and the deed to the building, will be turned over to my client, Mr. Mark Mills, as is his birthright." Clara felt Maya tense beside her. Luis's jaw tightened, but Clara remained perfectly still. She looked at her father. He was looking at his lawyer, a small, proud smile on his face. He truly believed he had won. Mr. Bowen held up one of his large, papery hands. "That won't be necessary. Mr. Henderson." His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. "I'm sorry," the lawyer said. Annoyed. "I said, that won't be necessary. Mr. Bowen repeated. He reached over to the bag Clara had placed on the table. He took out the metal box, opened it, and removed the first, thick document. He slid it across the polished wooden table. It stopped directly in front of Mark's lawyer. "What's this, Mr. Henderson asked. Picking it up, he began to read. Clara watched his smooth, confident expression flicker, then collapse. His eyes widened. He read it again, flipping the page to look at the judge's signature and the gold county seal. This is a final decree of adoption," he said, his voice no longer smooth. He looked at Mark. "It's dated 24 years ago." Mark snatched the paper from his lawyer's hand. He stared at it. Sarah leaned over, her brow furrowed. "What? What is that?" she whispered. "It's a fake." Mark sputtered, his face turning red. "That's a fake. We never. He couldn't have. We never signed anything." "Oh, but you did," Mr. Bowen said. He reached into the box and took out the second document. The thin, yellowed paper. He slid it across the table. Voluntary termination of parental rights. "As you'll recall," Mr. Bowen said, his voice dangerously soft, "your signatures are at the bottom. Witnessed, I see, by a notary public. A legally binding, irrevocable surrender." Sarah made a small, gasping sound. She stared at the paper, at her own looping, youthful signature. I thought that was just for guardianship. And then, Mr. Bowen said, his voice hardening, there is the matter of the consideration, the payment you received in exchange for this termination. He took the last item from the box, the single, folded sheet of notebook paper. He unfolded it, smoothed it flat, and placed it on the table in front of them all. He didn't read it. He just let them. Silence. A heavy, absolute silence filled the room. Clara watched as her younger sister, Mia, leaned forward to read the messy, angry scrawl. Mia read the words, and her perfectly made-up face seemed to shatter. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she looked at her parents. Her eyes were wide with a dawning, sickening horror. $5,000, Mia whispered, her voice trembling. She looked at Leo. Leo, did you? Leo shook his head, his own face pale. He stared at his father. Dad, take the kid. She's your problem now. This was new information for them. The lie they had been told that their parents had made a hard choice and left Clara with her loving grandfather was one thing. This was a transaction. This was a sale. Sarah wasn't acting now. She wasn't the martyr. She let out a choked, dry sob, a terrible sound, and buried her face in her hands. Mark's face had gone from red to a blotchy, sick-looking purple. His entire body was shaking. He wasn't looking at the letter. He was staring at Clara. His rage, the rage of a man who had been caught, who had been beaten, was so absolute, it was terrifying. He shoved his chair back, the legs scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He stood up, pointing a trembling finger at her. You, he roared, his voice cracking. You, bitch. That was private. He promised. He promised to send the money, Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it was not shaking. It was as solid as the workbench in the basement. She stood up, too, facing him across the table. He didn't promise to protect your secret. He promised to protect me. She looked at him, the man who had sold her. She looked at her mother, sobbing into her hands. She looked at Leo and Mia, who looked like their entire lives had just been revealed as a lie. He was my father, Clara said, her voice clear and strong. Arthur was my father, in every way that matters. He raised me. He loved me. He taught me. And he protected me. Even now, he protected me. From you. She looked at all of them, the 4 strangers who shared her blood, but none of her life. The lawsuit is over, she said. She turned to their lawyer, who was pale and already packing his briefcase, furious at his clients for lying to him. Mr. Bowen will be countersuing for legal fees and harassment. Now, she turned back to Mark. Get out of my bakery. Get out of my home. Get out of my life. They left. Their lawyer hurried them out, whispering harshly at Mark. Sarah was helped to her feet by Mia, who wouldn't look at her, her face a mask of disgust. Leo walked like a robot, his eyes fixed on the floor. Mark was the last to leave. He paused at the door and gave Clara one last look of pure, undiluted hatred. Then he was gone. The door clicked shut. Clara stood there for a long moment. Then, her legs gave out. She sank into her chair. Maya was instantly there, her arms around her. Luis put his large, warm hand on her shoulder. She wasn't crying. She just let out a long, slow breath. The breath she had been holding for 25 years. It was over. The next Saturday morning, you could smell Arthur's breads from halfway down the block. The ovens were on full blast, the air rich with the scent of cinnamon, cardamom, and the deep, tangy smell of fresh sourdough. The bakery was packed. The line was almost to the door. The tables were full, and the room was buzzing with happy, weekend chatter. Clara was behind the counter, her hair tied up, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She was laughing, her hands moving deftly, shaping loaves of brioche, a rhythm she knew as well as her own heartbeat. Luis was pulling a massive tray of golden brown sticky buns from the oven, and Maya was at the register, ringing up customers and teasing a small child about his cookie. Clara paused for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the controlled, happy chaos of her bakery, her home. She looked at the faces of her friends, her family. Her gaze drifted up to the wall above the pastry case. There was a framed photograph there, one she had put up just last week. It was her high school graduation. She was in a bright blue cap and gown, beaming, her arm linked with her grandfather's prude. He was in his best, slightly too small suit, and he was looking at her, not the camera. His face was shining with a look of such absolute, profound pride that it still made her throat tight. She looked at that photo, at the man who had chosen her, who had bought her, who had loved her, and she smiled. She was not the 8-year-old girl left on the porch. She was not the ward in a legal document. She was not the obstacle her parents had tried to remove. She was Arthur's daughter. She was a baker. And she was, finally and completely, home. A person's real family isn't always the one they are born with, but the people who show up and love them, no matter what. Have you ever had to find your chosen family? Or have you ever found strength from someone who loved you, even after they were gone? We'd love to read your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the strength of real love, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about resilience, hope, and the families we find. Thank you for listening.